When you open Honkai Star-Rail for the first time ever, the first thing you see is a cutscene of Kafka playing her imaginary violin while chaos ensues on Herder's space station. After this, the very first character you control is also Kafka, and when you first learn the mechanics of the combat system, it's all Kafka. As of this video releasing, we're just a few months away from the 1-year anniversary of Kafka's release in the game, and she's doing pretty good so far. Out of all the relatively earlier releases in Honkai Star-Rail, like Sealer, Jingran, and Blade, I think Kafka's the one who's managed to hold out the best with all these different characters being released around her. Even Bronya, who we thought could never fall off because of her amazing buffs, in addition to being able to pretty much double your DPS units' turns, is being put aside in favor of newer Harmony units. Well, why is Kafka holding up so well compared to other units? The answer is simply how her kit functions. Her scalings are decent, but most of the time they don't even matter. Since Kafka is a dot unit, this 160% attack scaling on her skill, this 80% attack scaling on her ult, and this 140% attack scaling on her follow-up barely matter at all. Unless you're a psychopath building Kritka, these scalings do pretty negligible damage in the grand scheme of things. The only scaling that matters is this one in her ult right here. While shocked, enemies receive lightning dot equal to 290% of Kafka's attack at the beginning of each turn. In terms of Kafka's personal damage, this is pretty much where it's all coming from. Now, so far this doesn't really sound like a good thing for Kafka. After all, her damage is just loaded into the dot in her ult. Well, the real important part of her kit is one of her major traces and her skill. Her A2 major trace states that when Kafka uses her ult, all characters will receive damage from any dot effects that are already on them, in addition to the shock that Kafka is applying. Her skill does a similar thing, with it also triggering dot effects but only at 75% of the original damage. Basically, Kafka doesn't only trigger her own shock from follow-up and ult, but also everyone else's dot effect. This ability makes her an absolute must-have on the team if you are playing around the dot mechanic. While characters like Blackswan and Sampo have decent dot multipliers and can probably clear hard content in teams built around them, if you simply add Kafka to the mix, she can double if not triple the damage you are outputting. So in terms of dot character releases power creeping Kafka, this unique mechanic of being able to trigger dot effects pretty much means when dot characters get stronger, like with Black Swan, Kafka will pretty much always have a place on the team and will scale up with these newer characters. Okay, now what if Hoyo releases characters that are direct competitors with Kafka? Someone else who can also trigger dot effects, except they just do it better. Well, this is where things get interesting, because I think all that will happen is Kafka would simply play with this character. Kafka isn't just there to trigger the dots, she has her own pretty good one in her ult and follow-up, and I'm guessing if a new dot trigger character gets added, they will also have other parts of their kit that defines them, whether it's buffing potential or just their own dot damage. In the same way Kafka helps dot units by increasing the frequency that their dots do damage, this new Powercreep version of Kafka would simply help Kafka's teams even more. Maybe they would replace Ranmei and this new dot core would be Kafka, Black Swan, and this new character. And this team would simply just continuously trigger dots almost every turn. Now, while I do think this won't power creep Kafka in the near future, there is a chance a long way away that so many better dot characters get released that Kafka finally gets kicked out of the premium dot team. But the way I see it now is that if a better dot trigger gets released, Kafka will simply play with this character. And if Kafka remains as the only dot trigger, stronger dot characters like Black Swan will simply join the team alongside her. The most likely scenario is that the characters around Kafka just keep getting replaced while she stays as this immovable object in dot teams. There's also one other reason I don't think Kafka is going to get Powercrept, and this time it's story based. Like I said at the start of the video, Kafka is the very first character we meet in the game, the first character we walk around with, and also the first character we play in combat. Not to mention she's also one of the most prominent members of the Stellaron Hunters. The Stellaron Hunters, from what we've seen so far, are the second most important group in the story, only after the Astral Express, with them showing up in pretty much all the planets we visit and even being involved in our Trailblazer's very own past. Kafka herself even tells us in her story quest that we are genetically her child, since a quarter of the data of our body is from her. Outside of story, within the community, I'm sure I don't need to explain how popular Kafka is as well. Now, obviously, Hoyo probably don't really care much about how much the community loves a character, but with how prevalent Kafka is in the story, how much the Trailblazer is involved with her, and how she's kind of a pseudo leader of the second most important faction we've met so far, it would be a really bad look for Hoyo to Powercreep her. And I think that's why they gave her such a unique kit in the first place. If she was a generic crit scaling DPS, it would be really hard to keep her relevant after pretty much every other new crit scaling DPS needs to be strong enough to build hype in the community. So making her a niche character who is really strong and almost a necessity to play in this niche was definitely intentional from Hoyo. Okay, now that we've talked about why I don't think Kafka can be Powercrept in a very long time, let's talk about the other side. How could Kafka, or specifically her premium team, evolve in the future to make Dot even stronger? Well, we obviously have what I already mentioned. If another powerful character gets released who can trigger teammates' dot effects like Kafka, there's a good chance that they would really work well with her. If they were to slide into the current premium dot team, it would probably be to replace Ranmei, or Robin I guess, since she's also pretty good in this slot, and just the ability to trigger the dots more often would probably be better than the buffs being provided. Now, something interesting about the Nihility path that should be noted is how versatile it is. When the game first started, I'm pretty sure a lot of the community, including myself, thought that this would generally be a supporting path that just specializes in debuffing the enemy. This idea was obviously supported by the in-game description and characters like Pella and Silverwolf. However, right now we've seen a lot more variety. We have dot characters obviously with Blackswan and some other 4 stars like Guinaifen and Luca, but we also just have a straight up DPS unit in Acheron. With that in mind, since Hoyo seems to be releasing characters specifically for dot, I don't think it's too out of the picture to have this entire team just be full Nihility units that specialize in dots. What I mean is, currently our best sustain for this dot team is Huohuo because of her attack percent buff and the energy regen. But what if they just straight up release a Nihility unit who provides some sustains, but also either provides their own dot damage or maybe a debuff on the enemy? A way Hoyo could implement this without straight up being an abundance character could be that when characters do dot damage, whether triggered by Kafka or just on the enemy taking action, this will heal the character who's afflicted this dot. This could maybe only happen when their ult is active, and their skill could maybe just be a defense down similar to Silverwolf's skill, or they could apply their own dot. Basically what I envision is, since Nihility doesn't seem to be showing any boundaries in what they can do, it wouldn't be surprising if they released a dot-based sustain unit who is in the Nihility path. Now what about the Ranmei/Robin slot? Just like how Nihility could have dot-based focused healers, I wouldn't be surprised if they introduced a dot-based buffer. Dot characters are generally looking for 3 buffs, those being attack percent, damage percent, and speed. Ranmei gives the damage percent and speed as well as some res pen in her ult, while Robin gives the attack percent and damage percent while having advanced forward and her own personal damage. Now these buffs are obviously going to be hard to top, but since we're talking about someone who specializes in buffing dots, having them power creep Ranmei and Robin's multipliers is perfectly fine since they're going to be incredibly niche. Let's say this character has a skill that's identical to Ranmei and Robin's, except it starts at a much lower multiplier. And then this buff increases every time the enemies take dot damage. Maybe their ult triggers all dots on enemies similar to Kafka's, but at a lower multiplier, so let's say 50% of the original damage. And then every time an enemy takes dot damage, all characters are advanced forward 25% or maybe 50%. I'm not too sure what amount would be balanced, but I'm sure you get the idea. Now, obviously these characters could have completely different kits from the ones I described, but I find it very likely that eventually we'll have 3 characters surrounding Kafka who are specifically designed to buff/sustain in a dot team, unlike Huohuo and Ranmei who just happen to have good buffs for dot. Now just to summarize, out of almost every unit in the game, I think Kafka is one of the ones safest from being Powercrept, simply because of how she plays with the dot mechanic. Direct power creep from similar characters would simply join her team, and characters that have extremely strong dot mechanics like blackswan would just want Kafka to help increase their own damage. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments about your thoughts on Kafka's future. Until next time, thanks for watching.